This episode is sponsored by Amethyst Durrant, a proud supporter of the Degrassi Kid Patreon.
All the kids should be there for you, whatever it is. You know she'll pull through, whatever it takes, or whatever it takes. Kids got you.
Hello, Degrassi fans, and welcome to the Degrassi Kid Podcast, where each week we break down the history and impact of our favorite teen TV show. I'm Jocelyn, and this week I have a question for you. How have you felt personally represented by Degrassi? Is it in the way they tell stories about queer characters? The way they represent different social classes? Or how about their mental health storylines with characters like Craig Manning, Eli Goldsworthy, Ellie Nash, Maya Matlin, or Cam Saunders? Degrassi is a show that made me feel represented through the character Fiona Coyne. Here was a young girl who looked just like me, going through the same struggles I was facing in high school. When it came to being a young, white, queer woman, Degrassi was telling my story, and they were telling it right. But even though they put so much care and attention into storylines about mental health, coming out, or different family structures, Degrassi often failed at telling impactful stories about characters of a different race, culture, or ethnicity. In February, we did an episode for Black History Month, where we sat down with Black Degrassi fans and discussed how the show failed at telling true-to-life stories about Black characters. After listening to this episode, a Degrassi fan named Miranda reached out and asked if I ever thought about covering Degrassi's Latine characters. Degrassi has a history of using names from typically Latin American roots, like Drew Torres, Imogen Marino, or Alex Nunez, without elaborating much on their character's cultural background. Oftentimes, they'll hire actors who identify with one culture but play another. Now, let me clarify. There is a big difference between race and ethnicity and culture. Race is characterized more so by your physical traits, where ethnicity is based on culture, language, and tradition. And on a show like Degrassi, they should be getting it right. In Linda Schuyler's memoir, The Mother of All Degrassi, she shares the story of how she was bullied in elementary school. She was a British immigrant who describes herself as having a funny accent, buck teeth, and who always wore a uniform to school. She was mocked and teased for being different, but still, she was white. When she became a teacher, she opened up her classroom door to find a group of young, diverse kids, all from different, various cultural backgrounds. If I was bullied as a young white girl, she thought, I can only imagine what they're going through. So with race and ethnicity at the top of mind for the show's creator, why did they struggle to capture the diversity of a real-life classroom in Degrassi: The Next Generation? Why were white characters at the center of almost every conflict, while their BIPOC characters were often poorly written, underrepresented, or didn't exist at all? Today, we're sitting down with Miranda, a Latina Degrassi fan, to explore where Degrassi went wrong, where they went right, and how they could be better. And it's only going to happen here on a brand new episode of the Degrassi Kid Podcast. Hi, Miranda. Welcome to the Degrassi Kid Podcast. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Hi, Jocelyn. I'm really excited to be here.
The reason that you're here today is because we are celebrating Latine Heritage Month, and I wanted to ask you before we talk about Degrassi, what does Latina Heritage Month mean to you?
It's a great question. I think what Latina Heritage Month means to me is just a celebration of my culture. It highlights the day that multiple countries in Latin America gained their independence, which is why it starts on the 15th. And it's just a great way to spotlight our culture in a way that normally isn't.
Soon, I'm going to pick your brain a little bit more about that. But first, I want to find out how you became such a huge Degrassi fan. What made you connect with the show? When did you find it? What made you love Degrassi?
I started watching Degrassi right around season 10. I remember I was at my cousin's house. They were in like junior high or early high school. And there's the trailer for Degrassi Takes Manhattan came on. And they went, oh! And I was like, why? What's the issue? There's just two people kissing. And then my cousins look at me and they go, they're twins. And I was like, what?
Oh my God, Twincest was your first adventure with Degrassi.
Yes. And then I was
Wow.
like, I'm so interested. I need to watch this. And then I started at season 10 and I fell in love from there. And I've been a fan ever since.
Oh my God, I love that. And who's your favorite character?
Eli.
Eli, hands down. What makes him your favorite character?
He's the reason I was emo in middle school and high school. I love his character, even when the writers did some out-of-pocket things with him in the later seasons.
Mm-hmm.
I love Eli. He's always been my favorite. I think he's well written. I think they handle a lot of his storylines really well, and yeah, he's great.
I love that. I love that he inspired your emo phase. That is one of my favorite stories from a Degrassi fan. Just in general, are there any favorite storylines that you have that you always love to go back and rewatch because you just love watching them?
I got one of my childhood best friends to watch Degrassi, and he went ballistic over the Anya faking her pregnancy scene because he thought that was the most chaotic thing, and it was over like a high school presidency.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, just because I have like really funny memories of my friend texting me being like, what am I watching? What is going on?
What an iconic moment. I love that. Well, one of the other things I wanted to ask you is because, I connect with Degrassi so much because I saw myself on the show. There was this young queer girl who told her story through Fiona Coyne. And I want to know, was there any characters on Degrassi that you saw yourself in for any reason?
I think I was able to draw bits and pieces from different characters. So Eli, again, not just because we were both emo, but I definitely related to a lot of his mental health struggles and how they depicted that. And then also Terry. I watched the older seasons when I was a little bit older, but watching her, go through being at that age as a plus size girl, not having like that same level of romantic attention as her friends.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just something that I really related to at that time. So I want to say Terry and Eli.
Those are two. Okay. I would love to see them as either like a couple or best friends, like seeing them together on the show. They would have been iconic together. I would have absolutely loved that.
I don't think they would have been a good couple, but I think they would have been good friends.
They would have been friends. I'll take it. I think they would have been. I would have loved to see the adventures they get up to, and especially because we recently had Christina Schmidt on the podcast. Did you get to listen to that episode?
Yeah, I've listened to every episode of the podcast.
You're a fan. Well, that actually perfectly segues into my next question, because the reason that we're meeting together today is because you reached out to me after my Black History Month episode. You said, hey, I would love to do this about Latina characters on Degrassi. So I want to know, what was it that made you want to reach out and get this episode started with me?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think you said something at the end of the Black History Month episode about wanting to continue conversations about representation.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to speak to my own experience about being like a Latina woman and not seeing myself on the show. And I want to, encourage a space for people of minority backgrounds to talk about their experiences, because Degrassi is supposed to be representative of everyone, and when they try, it's not always the best, as we see with Black characters like Liberty, Marisol, and Hazel.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think it's important to talk about representation and like giving space to people to talk about their lived experiences and how they see themselves in representation.
Mm-hmm.
And I can only speak to my lived experience as a Latina, so I can talk about that, but that should also encourage other people from other backgrounds to want to talk about their experiences with representation, whether it's there or not, or done poorly, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, absolutely. I was so stoked when you reached out, because everybody knows the reason I connect with Degrassi is because there was a queer character that I saw myself in, and having that connection of seeing someone who looked like me, who had the same experiences as me, and went through the same process of coming out as me, made me feel so seen and heard. I mean, to the point that 15 years later, here I am still trying to trudge on the memories that I had of watching Degrassi, right? So I completely understand what it's like to feel that representation from a TV show. And then reversely, I've been learning so much about different groups of people who haven't had that same experiences of seeing themselves on TV, because TV just isn't as diverse of a landscape. And how surprising when it comes to a show like Degrassi, like you just said, that prides itself on making everybody feel seen and making everybody feel heard. And there's so many people who are being missed on the show, specifically because we love to put white people at the center of Degrassi and then have these side characters whose cultures aren't necessarily explored. So I'm really excited to do this episode with you, because already we had a conversation before we were recording where you were teaching me so much about the history of Latin America and independence and different language to use. And I would love for the listeners of the Degrassi Kid podcast to have some of that conversation on here, to show that like it is important to keep learning, and it is important to ask questions and present yourself with these things. I am very, very thankful that you reached out and said, hey, I want to help you continue that conversation with other groups of characters on Degrassi. So I wanted to ask you, one of the big things when it comes to language is the difference between Latino, Latinx, Latina, Hispanic. What is the correct language to use, and what's kind of the history that comes with that language, like you were telling me about earlier?
First of all, thank you. That was very sweet.
Thank you.
And I also just want to caveat by saying I am by no means an expert in this. I'm speaking from lived experiences and some courses I've taken in undergrad. So if I get anything wrong, I apologize. But to go to your point about language, so the difference between Hispanic and Latino, Latine, Latina. So for Hispanic, it basically means you are descendant from a Spanish-speaking country. So that would include Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Colombia. Latino is you are descendant from Latin America. So that would include Brazil, but not include Spain. So if you're from Spain, you are Hispanic, you are not Latino. If you are from Brazil, you are Latino, not Hispanic. And different countries and people of those ethnicities have their own ways of identifying, so I don't want to speak over for that. Mm-hmm. And then the other difference is Latino, Latina, Latine, Latinx. So Latino, Latina is, the gendered way of saying it in Spanish. So Latino refers to men, Latina refers to women. So I'm referring to myself as Latina because I'm a cisgender woman. Mm-hmm. And then Latine, Latinx are the gender neutral ways of saying it. Latinx originated sometime in the 2000s by Puerto Ricans who wanted to have more gender inclusive language. And it had some pushback because you can't really use the X in Spanish. And in more recent years, the push for Latine has been made because you can use the E in Spanish to conjugate. So hence the big difference. But you can see different people using it. It also varies on generation and who wants to use what terms.
That is so interesting. I've loved learning about this stuff. And I also want to emphasize that I love that you're coming in with your own perspective and being clear that hey, I have my own lived experience. I'm not completely an expert, but I want to say that I love that that you coming in and even sharing these kinds of stories is so impactful. And I'm so thankful that you're doing that. I also really loved one other thing you were telling me about is when it comes to identifying as Hispanic. I loved learning about the history of that, where you were telling me a little bit about how you would not say that you are Hispanic because of kind of the history that comes with that language. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So for reference, I live in the United States. I've lived here my whole life. And in the United States, the word Hispanic was originally used by the U.S. government on the census because they needed a way to account for the rise of people from Latin America coming, as well as accounting for taking over the Southwest and taking part of Mexico's land. So they needed to account for that population demographic. So that word was given to us by the U.S. government, and I personally don't like to use it. I mean, technically, I am Hispanic because I'm Mexican and Puerto Rican, so I am descendant from Hispanic countries, but that's just not a term I would use for myself.
Well, another thing that's interesting too is that I also need to learn more about is definitely the culture, the Latine culture in Canada, because a lot of the research even online is so American focused that I know that after this podcast, I'm going to continue kind of learning a little bit myself of okay, well, how does that impact Canadian history as well? Because I thought it's so interesting to learn about language and the history of language when someone else says this is the definition of who you are. And you're like, yeah, I fit that definition, but that's not the definition I would use for myself. So I thought it was really interesting to hear that from you educating us on that of, yes, Hispanic is the word that defines me, but I'm not defined by that word. So I really, really liked hearing about that. Another thing that I really, really, really wanted to get in, now that we kind of have a history of how this month came to be, and also a little bit of learning about you and your history, and also just generally, I wanted to talk about Degrassi specifically and break down some characters in the show, break down just some decisions they've made behind the scenes, and kind of get your input about that. How do you feel about that?
I'm excited. Let's go.
You're like, that's why I'm here, baby. The first question I have for you is I wanted to know, when it comes to characters, we have Drew Torres, we have Imogen Marino, we have Alex Nunes. I'm curious your thoughts about when Degrassi specifically gives their characters last names that are very popular in Latin America and may imply that they have Latina or Latino heritage, but it's not necessarily represented in their character or shown throughout any of their storylines. What does that mean to you, or how does that impact you?
I remember watching it for the first time and having false hope that I was going to be represented on screen, and only to realize that wasn't the case, either by the actual background of the actor portraying the character or just that the character talk about their home life. Or in the case of Imogen, I remember thinking, oh my God, she's Puerto Rican. She has a last name Moreno, just like Rita Moreno. And I was like, oh my God, I feel so seen. And then there's like a quick scene with her and Eli and Adam. And I think she goes, oh, Marino, it's Italian. I was like, oh, okay, never mind.
Dreams crushed.
And I remember that broke my like 11, 12-year-old heart. Because I loved Imogen so much when I was younger. And I was like, I wanted to see myself in her, but I couldn't because she didn't necessarily look like me, and she was Italian. She wasn't Latina.
Do you think that's an experience that was probably common amongst many Latine fans watching the show, having this experience of being like, finally, and then not getting it?
I'm sure, just because I feel like there was a lot of false hope, especially with like the last names of characters, like how you described. So like Drew and Adam, for example, like I was optimistic, especially because there's a scene in early season 10 when Adam's in the ballroom class, and then Bianca goes, your last name, that's Torres, right? And I was like, oh, okay. And they just never went anywhere with it. I think at the time I assumed they may have been Portuguese, because at least in my lived experience, I know when Torres ends with the S, at least to me, that was more of a Portuguese name.
Yeah.
But I've learned as I've gotten older, it's used in both Spanish and Portuguese. So.
Oh, interesting.
I just kept looking for justifications for why they weren't when I was growing up.
Yeah. And that's the thing is Degrassi does this thing where they use these specific last names, and then they never really go there with why they've chosen those names. And that's something that I wish I would be interested to really ask. I'm not sure if it's the writers that come up with the names or who comes up with the names, but why put the intention into choosing these characters' names, making it a point that these are their names, and then not going anywhere with it when you're a show that wants to represent people? So I think that's very interesting to think about from a viewer perspective, something that I've never had to consider. So in talking about where Degrassi uses these last names and kind of gets it wrong, what are ways that you think Degrassi could get it right whenever it comes to, writing Latina or characters that have this Latina heritage? What does it look like when it's done well?
I think it looks like when it's done well is recognizing that we're not a monolith. And I think any ethnic or minority group would say the exact same thing. Like, we're not a monolith. Our stories are all unique and deserve to be told. I think the biggest example for me is Netflix's One Day at a Time. It's a show about a Cuban-American family in Los Angeles, and it's just about their life. It's a sitcom. It has Rita Moreno in it. It's great. And it was unfortunately canceled, and then brought to Pop TV, which hosts Schitt's Creek.
Oh, nice.
Went on for one more season, and they got canceled again.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was rough. But it's just a very human show. It talks about grief. It talks about the eldest daughter, Elena, coming out as gay. It talks about the mom, Penelope, who struggles with PTSD and is a veteran. And it's like, I remember I started watching One Day at a Time when I was a freshman in college, and I was really homesick. I was really missing my family. And when I watched that show, I felt like I was home. Like I was, in the living room with them. Because it was such a homey show. Not just because it's comforting, but because I could see myself, I could see my mom in these characters, I could see my little brother. So like that type of media is really important, and it's, at least for me, has been kind of few and far between.
Oh yeah, I can completely understand that. That is so cool. You know what? I've seen the first 3 episodes, I think, of One Day at a Time, and I got to get back into it because I really, really loved, specifically that they talked about queer characters. That's always my favorite in any TV show. But that I remember seeing that storyline come out, and I was very stoked about watching the show for that reason. So I'll have to get back into it and check it out.
It's great. You should definitely give it a watch.
I love that. And I love the idea. I love the quote you said that we're not a monolith, because I think Degrassi does grasp that with different groups very well. Like, they actively have talked about how much they want their queer characters to not just be the gay kid, or have her just be the pregnant girl, or have him just be the drug addict. They want these people to have diverse storylines, where you see them at home, you see them at school, you see them, maybe they go to camp or wherever. Degrassi puts so much intention behind so many specific groups of people that's again where my surprise comes in, that they didn't do it culturally. They didn't put that same intention. They seem to understand the value in so many spaces, but didn't understand the value when it came to people's culture and when it came to people's identity, unless it was kind of like a white Canadian, except for some, various examples. But overall, they just totally missed it when it came to that idea of completing a fully dimensional character with a varying background. The next thing I wanted to ask you about was specifically your thoughts on the fact that Degrassi doesn't always consider the actor's background when it comes to casting. So, for example, Deanna Casalus, she played Alex, and in real life, she has an Italian heritage. But on the show, I believe Alex is a Latina character, or intended to be a Latina character. And Degrassi kind of does that often, where they hire someone from this background, but then their character will be this background, but then they never really explore that background with the character. And I'm curious on your thoughts on Degrassi intentionally kind of mismatching cultures between actors and characters and then not really doing anything about it. What's your thoughts on that?
It's frustrating, and I think it also goes further than like white actress cast to play Latina character.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also goes deeper to being like a Mexican person cast to play a Puerto Rican, because just because they're both from Latin America doesn't mean that it's the same. Like I'm Mexican and Puerto Rican, and there are things I've said with like in my Mexican side that does not work in the Puerto Rican side, and vice versa. It's not the same.
Mm-hmm.
So I also think it's just another way for like white actors to kind of profit off of minority culture in a way that will just inevitably benefit them. And I'm not trying to speak ill on any of the actors in Degrassi, but one example that comes to mind is American actress Ronnie Hawk, who was in the Netflix show On My Block. She is a white woman, but she has consistently played like Latina characters and has made pretty racist and insensitive remarks about specifically Mexicans. But like she's profiting off of playing Latina characters because they will cast white people who look like the Hollywood version of a Latino character, or Latina character, because they are more marketable inevitably, just because they have olive skin or slightly tan skin and dark hair. When that does, just having those features looking vaguely like Sofia Vergara does not make you Latina. Like you can be white and be Latina, like Anya Taylor-Joy. You can be black and be Latina, like Gina Torres. You can be Asian and be Latina. You can be indigenous. You can be everything. Because being Latina or being from Latin America is an ethnicity, not a race.
Yes.
And I feel like that also gets lost a lot.
That's one of the first things that I had learned when I was doing research for this episode is I had like kind of an Americanized, Hollywoodized idea of what it meant to be Latina. And that's when I learned, actually, I specifically watched this girl and it helped a lot because she went around on the street. It was like a little YouTube video. She went around the street and she asked people the difference between Hispanic, Latina, and Spanish. And then she also showed people pictures and said, can you categorize who is Latina, who is Hispanic, who is Spanish? And I watched all these people who are just like me, fumbling over their answers, not coming up with the stuff. They're like, oh, I know that. And then at the end, she was like, you can't, any one of these people could be any one of these things. This is not how these words work. And watching people have the same ignorance that I do answer that was very humbling. So I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what I sound like being uneducated. But it was also, it worked so well because the way that she explained it was on my level of like, oh, this idea that I have from movies, from the type of people who are cast to play these roles is not reflective of the real world. And it's almost embarrassing to open your own eyes to your own prejudice of like, oh my gosh, I've let someone else paint a narrative of what this culture is like or what this group is like. But yes, it's really interesting to think about when it comes to Degrassi, because Degrassi feels like a show that has such good intentions, and they do, but they didn't put that step in educating themselves and then ultimately just end up perpetrating the stereotypes that they're trying to reduce by reducing harm to these communities, right? So I completely see the point of having to correct the way that the world teaches us about certain groups of people. One of the things that you mentioned to me specifically was your thoughts on Bianca D'Souza and how her character changes from when she starts on the show to when she ends on the show. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I've noticed people talk about this on the Degrassi Twitterverse, so I did not originate this thought, but it's something I think is important to talk about. So when Bianca in like season 10, when she's in her bad girl phase, she has really big, thick, curly hair. She wears big hoops. She dresses more provocatively, and she's involved in gangs. And that imagery and that characterization is so closely tied to the stereotypical version of what a Latina looks like. And you could say her last name could evoke that same thought. How Elisa Jospovich looks, you could think that especially if you're a young person and you don't really have that understanding when you're first watching the show, like I was. But when Bianca gets her life together, in a sense, like she leaves gang life, she goes off to university, she and Drew get engaged. Like, her hair is straight, she dresses more conservatively and is closer to whiteness in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
So I just always thought that was interesting, that whenever Degrassi is like looking for a bad girl, they'll rely on ethnic stereotypes or ethnic imagery to tell that. Like, when she's coded as Latina, she's a boyfriend stealer, she's in the boiler room, she has, you know, the bigger the hoop, bigger the hoe type shit. Yeah, so that's something that I remember seeing somebody on Twitter talk about, and after they brought it up, like, that's all I could see. And I remember even watching the show growing up, I thought Bianca may have been Latina, but I'm like, why am I looking to see myself on screen in somebody who is very clearly meant to be a stereotype?
Wow, that is so interesting to have it. So yeah, Degrassi's played into these stereotypes, and that's what you're seeing as yourself. That's how you're seeing yourself represented on screen. That is such an interesting and unique perspective of watching, you know, media and TV that I've just never had to consider before. Of when you're looking for yourself, you're looking for stereotypes. Because even when it came to queer media, which I always bring up queer media because that's the way that I relate to the show Degrassi. Degrassi had never handled queerness in that kind of way. They put so much care into the queer characters because of Linda's history of having a queer best friend who was gay bashed and went through all these different things. That just kind of media viewing experiences isn't something that I had to seek out in my own favorite show, is looking at the stereotype. You know, they never had like bull dyke lesbian on the show. They always had fully formed characters and never ever played into those stereotypes. And it's so interesting. You know, when I go back and rewatch the show to look at Bianca and her transition of, you're so right. She's a Latina coded character who then becomes this more idea of whiteness and loses all of those stereotypical things. That is so interesting. This is why I'm so happy that you sat down on this podcast, because it gives me a new viewing experience for Degrassi from different points of view, which is someone who's watched the show for 15 years. Never would have picked up on that kind of experience of what it's like to see yourself in Bianca and then see it get lost because, you know, they've played into stereotypes and they're doing these things that they're trying so hard not to do for other communities. Thank you so much, Miranda. This is great. I am loving this conversation and learning so much.
I also want to clarify, I did not see myself in Bianca when she was being super transphobic and awful to Adam. I want to make that very clear.
I wanted to ask you, you know, it's very clearly identified where Degrassi got it wrong. But I'm wondering, is there any characters or even moments on the show where you feel like this is when they got it right?
When it comes to like Latina characters, there isn't really ones that come to mind. I know Lola is confirmed to be Latina because she's Argentinian. I'm going to admit, Next Class is not my favorite era of Degrassi, so I don't remember it as well. But I can also confidently say that Degrassi has gotten other elements of identity right. So when it comes to mental health struggles, like, Degrassi has nailed it. Like, I've genuinely felt very seen in that respect. I felt very seen in Terry, just, you know, being like a plus size person and, you know, seeing all my friends go through romantic experiences and just feeling like I was inadequate because I didn't look like them. Or Eli in his emo phase, because it's not hard to get being an emo kid wrong. But in that respect, I felt seen in those snippets. But when it came to like my ethnic and cultural identity, no, not really.
Yeah, I think that's so fair. I think that, you know, I also was not necessarily a fan of Degrassi Next Class. I will give some credit the fact that I was long out of high school, you know, so maybe that's why it didn't resonate with the show. But I think that when it came to Degrassi Next Class's characters development and representing more diverse groups, I think they were getting so close. But I really feel like because of the change in medium, like now they were streaming, now there's only 10 episodes. Now we have built up all these characters and now we have to introduce more, but they're graduating. Now I think they got so lost in that they weren't able to keep that trajectory. Like, I know that now they're introducing, not specifically Latina characters, but I'm thinking like they started introducing Syrian refugee characters. Now gay kids weren't coming out anymore. There was more kids with disabilities on the show. I was really hopeful that we were working towards a Degrassi that was finally gonna get it. But my question for you is, there's this looming Degrassi reboot that may happen, may never happen. If a Degrassi reboot comes back, what would you like to see done when it specifically comes to Latina characters in the show? What would you ask the writers to do or give them advice about?
I would say don't write Latina characters, or really any ethnic character, for white audiences. Like, you don't have to cater us to be palatable to a white audience. Like, Abbott Elementary does not cater its show to be good to white people. It is a black show with black creators, and it's hilarious. It's one of the best shows out right now. And, like, it's not tailored to be for white people. It's just a black show. So if you're going to have Latina people or ethnic writers in the room, have them write. Don't ask them to tailor it to fit a white audience. And also, again, we are not a monolith. There are people who have just immigrated to the United States, for example, or Canada, and are much more closely connected to to their home country, to the language, to the culture. And there are people like me who are second gen, or people like some of my friends who are third, fourth, fifth gen, who don't feel as connected. And I think that's like an interesting storyline. I think a storyline I would really like to see in the reboot is, you know, the comparison of someone who's either first gen or an immigrant who's very connected to the culture to someone who's maybe second, third gen, or however more, who doesn't necessarily speak Spanish or speak Portuguese if they're Brazilian, and wants to feel more connected to the culture but is really struggling. Like, personally, I had my own long journey of being like a no sabo kid and then learning Spanish in undergrad, and now I use it in my job, and it's great. But I really would have liked it. It would have been really good for me as a kid to see that represented. Like, okay, I'm not an outlier for not being able to speak Spanish, or whatever the native tongue is, if they want to represent someone who doesn't speak Spanish but is from Latin America.
I love that. That is my hope for the reboot, because I know exactly how it feels to be seen on TV, and I know that people just like me, we've had our stories told 100,000 times. It's so much more interesting to see new stories be told, and I want people to have that experience so badly, because it feels so good to see a character on TV that you can relate to. And I'm so sad that my favorite TV show didn't do more of that, and instead focused on only people who look like, or mostly people who look like me, or most people from my background, or that kind of thing. And I'm really hopeful for the new age of TV that we continue to see shows like Abbott Elementary that tell those different stories and make them more mainstream, because it's so interesting to see them. And yeah. So my final question for you, is there any other characters or any other moments on the show that we haven't talked about that you were kind of hoping we would touch upon or speak about? The hard part about this episode is there's like no characters who actually hit it well, so there's not many to talk about.
Yeah, like, I know, like, Zoe, her last name is Rivas. Like, I was right before we got on the call, I was like going through their wiki on the Degrassi wiki, like trying to find clips on YouTube just so I could like refresh my memory a little bit more. And like, her last name is Rivas. In West Drive, she's Gatsby Garcia. Like, she's clearly meant to be like at least Hispanic. And I remember like her mom calls her Mija at some point, and I like looked for the scene on Netflix and it wasn't there, so I guess I was maybe misremembering it. But like, you know, Zoe's mom is homophobic for some god-awful reason. And like, Zoe's character obviously had more to do with like her coming out and her sexuality and her being a survivor. Like, it had very little to do with like her ethnicity. Yeah. Which is fine. Like, you don't, just because you're of a certain ethnicity doesn't mean your whole story needs to be about your culture. But I think it would have been nice.
I agree. I think it would have been really, really nice too to see those, because that's what, again, I think they were getting there with Next Class, because when it came to diversity in their queer storytelling, well, now it wasn't just mostly white kids that they were talking about. It was anyone at Degrassi could be gay at that point in Next Class, and anyone could be out of the closet and could be bisexual and be this. And I think they were getting there, but I know what a story looks like from a white queer person's perspective of what it means to come out. And I would have loved, even as a queer person, to learn, what does that look like for different groups of people? Like, if Manny had have come out, what would her parents have reacted that way? Or if Hazel or if Liberty had come out, what do these different kind of cultures and backgrounds, how do they handle someone coming out? I'd love to learn more about that. And how does someone overcome that and find safety at a place like Degrassi, or find differences at Degrassi where they can come together over them? So I think even I just wish we would have had more diverse characters, even if they were going through some of the same struggles that they've already covered, because Degrassi covers the same topics over and over again. And I think you don't always got to put the same kind of culture. And I know I keep saying white person, and that's also not right, because anyone who's Latina, you can be white as well, but that's who I am. That's the experience that's reflected on Degrassi always. And I know they're a Canadian TV show, but there's so many people in Canada and so many stories to be told, and they can do better at telling more of them. The biggest question I have for you is, if everybody wants to catch up with you on social media, where can they find you?
I am not the most active on social media, but if you want to see pictures of my cat, you can find me on Instagram at mxranda with 3 A's. And if you want various retweets of movie facts,
love that.
My Twitter is at Tear in My Heart. That's TAIRE in my heart.
I love that.
A little Les Mis 21 Pilots pun that I came up with when I was 14 and never changed.
Oh, I love that. Those are the best kind of usernames. Also, I have to ask you, if you feel okay, will you please share us the story of how you briefly connected with Aislinn Paul? Now that you bring up your cats, I have to have you tell it. Please, please, please.
Yes. So rewind back to 2020 or early 2021, Aislinn Paul, who plays Claire, obviously, had shared something on her social media about this being sad about another birthday in quarantine, and was asking for things to, brighten her mood. And I had my cat for a couple of months at that point, so I just sent her a couple photos of my cat, Misu, and she responded. She thought Misu was the cutest, because she is. And we just talked really briefly. I told her that I've been struggling in quarantine, and rewatching old episodes of Degrassi have been like a good way to help me get through it. And she was just appreciative that it was working for her, and loved pictures of my cat.
That is so cool. I was so excited when you told me that story. That is one of the, it's cool to talk to the Degrassi cat, but for them to comment on your cat and connect that way, that is really freaking cool. I like that.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, to wrap this all up, I'm going to ask you one final question. Miranda, what would it mean to you if you saw people who looked like you, who came from your culture, who shared experiences like you? What would it mean to you if you had seen those storylines reflected on Degrassi?
I think it would have been really impactful to see myself on screen, and as a reminder that not only that people that are like me exist, but that we matter. I've had situations in school where a teacher told me that my people didn't exist during that time, and that we didn't matter. And it's hard. And when that's constantly reinforced on screen because you're not there, or you're represented in the worst way, it's hard, especially for young people. So it's really important to see yourself, and I will spare you of my Star Wars example of seeing yourself on screen and what that meant to me.
Please tell us, please.
Okay. So one of the first times I remember feeling really seen on TV is back in 2008 when the Star Wars: The Clone Wars movie came out. I'm a big Star Wars fan. I love Ahsoka Tano. I love the new Ahsoka show. And I remember I saw her coming off the Star Cruiser, and I was 8 or 9 years old, and I saw her, and I was like, oh my God, that's me. Because I came out the womb loving Star Wars. And when I would play Star Wars on the playground, I only had between Padme and Leia to choose from. And they're both cool. I love both of them. But I wanted a lightsaber. So I was like, I'll be Mace Windu's daughter because he's the only not white Jedi. He's probably my dad. Whatever.
I love that.
And I remember when I saw Ahsoka, I fell in love with her. And it was the first time I ever felt seen. And I was just so attached to that character. And for anyone who's a Star Wars fan who's listening, they probably know this, but Ahsoka was deeply hated when she first came was first introduced. They thought she was annoying, she wasn't in the prequel movies, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I don't care. I love her. And 9-10-year-old me was defending her to middle-aged Star Wars fans who didn't think I was a real Star Wars fan because I was a girl.
Oh my gosh.
And that was the first time I ever truly felt seen in any respect. And that was so powerful for me. And she's an orange alien in outer space, but she's one of the most important fictional characters in my life and that I've ever experienced. I think she's my Fiona Coin to you.
I was going to say, it's a connection that sits with you for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah. In my bedroom right now, I have multiple pieces of Ahsoka art like everywhere. I have like 2 Ahsoka t-shirts in my dresser. Like I have Ahsoka everything. I think she's my wallpaper. Yeah, she's my wallpaper on my phone.
Same with Fiona. I got a Fiona Coin shirt on. Annie Clark's my background. I get it. I get it. She really is your Annie Clark. I love that.
Yeah. So yeah, that's my answer about the first time and how important it is to feel seen. And for me, that's Ahsoka Tano.
Wow. I know, like, the fact that you said we were, 8 or 9 years old when this happened?
Yeah, I think, Clone Wars premiered in 2008, so I think I was like 8 going on 9.
Wow. And that's what I mean about these connections is it's crazy how just seeing one person on TV can literally stick with you for the rest of your life and have that stand out for you. So, Miranda, I am so happy that you shared your stories with us. I'm also so happy that you started this discussion because I think I was saying this before we were recording is that I never would have taken the time to learn about, Latine Heritage Month. I never would have learned the difference about the language. I never would have learned even these things about how you view Bianca or getting that, oh my God, Imogen, finally we have that character. I never would have learned about those experiences from other Degrassi fans or from your experiences if you hadn't have reached out and said, hey, I want to talk about Latina characters on Degrassi. I'm so stoked that you had this conversation with me. I'm so stoked to release this for Latina Heritage Month. And I also want to shout you out because I know that on the 28th? The 28th is your birthday. So I want to wish you a happy birthday and encourage all Degrassi fans to send you a happy birthday when this comes out. So thank you, Miranda. This was such a good podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm like kind of in disbelief that this happened. I've been bragging about this to literally anyone who will listen to me. So I'm super grateful and excited to be here.
You're officially a Degrassi kid now, baby. Okay, thank you, Miranda. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.